You could try to play, but you're never gonna beat me. Look the other way, what I'm doing ain't easy. Bloody hands stained from the people who deceive me. Muddy hands break through the chains, go free me. Looking for change, looking for pain, pulling a mob, pushing a train. I'll never stop, stick to a lane, pick up the pieces and go rearrange. I'll be the best above all the rest, put me to the test and expect nothing less. You check as I'm chess, what's happening next? Yeah. He got the venom, a tangible weapon, no coming in second. This life is a lesson. He got a new engine from pain, it's a blessing. New focus, no guessing, just bold and obsession. All in his possession, you got their attention. I leave an impression and take a redemption. Just kill no discretion. Your mind is a weapon. 11-11, it's time for progression. Oh.
G'day, hey, welcome back to everyone to Star Season Patriots of Down Under. I'm Chris, your host, and I thank you for all being with me here today on this second chapter of Genesis of a New Space for a New Space Age by John B. Leith. Chapter 2. Yes, today we're only going to be doing 8 pages within this chapter. It's a small chapter, unlike the first chapter, which was as you all know, that joined me for the first chapter, that we had the introduction, the prologue, and the following pages. I think it was 17 pages. So we read about 22, nearly 23 pages that first sitting. So this one, I promise you, won't be as long today. But in saying that, let's get into it. Okay, because yeah, it's only 8 pages. So yeah, what better time than right now to start? So let's have a look at this. Okay, so let's go up to, here we go. All right, Chapter 2, Early American Development of the Unconventional Aeroplane. Okay, so the reader, here we go. All right, the reader must be asking questions. Why haven't I learned of these cosmic visitations before? Why doesn't the government explain? Why the suppression of UFO landings? The authors asked the same questions when they began to dig into the mystery 3 years ago. Today, there are many thousands of persons around the world who are engaged in keeping the alien presence and their unidentified flying objects under censorship wraps. It's the UAP congressional hearing that's been going on recently, and all the gatekeepers that Dr. Salah has been talking about on his channel, and covering all that information and the key players. I highly recommend everyone go over to Dr. Salah's channel and please check his information out, please. I can't ask you enough. He is at the forefront and the spearhead of disclosure right now, and his information is top-notch. Okay, this unchangeable posture of silence exists in both democratic and totalitarian countries. It began with typical military reasoning that the public should not be informed. If to do so, national sovereignty would be jeopardized. It proceeded with the assumption that the public was not prepared for such astounding revelations and could not cope with them. American governmental censorship of UFO information seems to be the typical of that in other countries and extends back nearly 50 years to the mid-1930s at the time of this writing of this book. Remember, it was 1981 that this book came out. So at that time, 50 years. It's now been roughly 73 years since the 1950s. So it's a long time of these groups going without any form of oversight of any kind. You know what I mean? So it's a long time. In the mid-1930s, military secrecy about an unusual American invention in the field of powered flight triggered the first blackout of public knowledge. It all began in 1935 because of a young aeronautical engineer with a high school education and 2 years study in the School of Mechanical Engineering at Oregon State College. He later became a World War I flyer. His name at the time was Jonathan E. Coldwell, and he lived near Glen Burnie, Maryland, US. He invented and built a lighter-than-air machine, which, in addition to conventional nose propulsion, was driven by a 9-cylinder, 45 horsepower French engine with controlled speed blades, each 3 feet long by 12 inches wide, mounted on top of a midship, which enabled the plane to ascend or descend vertically or even hover. The blades were attached to the cardinal points of a 14-foot wooden disc which was free revolving, deriving its momentum from the power-driven nose prop blast. The canvas-covered tubular steel plane, christened the Grey Goose, had been constructed in a tobacco warehouse and then tested on a Maryland farm of the Coldwell's friend Louis Pumphrey on State Road Number 3, Anne Arundel country. The machine flew fairly well. It was actually the wingless forerunner of today's helicopter. Not satisfied with his initial achievement, a few months later, Coldwell completed a fundamentally different design named the rotorplane. Similar to an earlier model, the spectacular lifting capability of which had been tested successfully in Denver, Colorado in 1923. Notwithstanding its lifting power, this machine proved to be less maneuverable. Its energy source consisted of 6 large pitched rotor blades encased in a single 12-foot diameter rim or flange above and in the center of which the operator sat. A news story at the time referred to the contraption as a flying joke. But regardless of critics and lampooners, Coldwell was not deterred from this dream of a round-wing air machine. He began his final prototype, which would indeed prove successful. The later model was 28 feet in diameter and would disappear before the press was allowed to examine it closely. Although it had been used openly and proved rides and given used openly to provide rides and give demonstrations to interested observers and investors. The machine resembled a huge tub with a set of 6 blades projecting out from both the top and the bottom of the hub. In the center of the affair was the round tubular housing or cockpit containing seats for 2 persons, plus gauges, gears, and levers, and of course, the motor. The first motor was an 8-cylinder Ford V8 gasoline engine with the block cut in half. This motor was considered heavy and troublesome in operation and was later replaced by a newly cast 4-cylinder lightweight aluminum block, along with aluminum gears, which were then later substituted with bronze. The operator sat in the top of the center tubing or hub or tubbing with the hub, with his head and shoulders above for the purposes of sight navigation. Hands and feet operated with ease the levers and pedals for speed and direction. The bottom set of 6 left blades were wide, fixed at a slight angle, and they turned clockwise. They had a controlled speed operated by one of the gears. The 6 maneuverable pitch blades located topside were for lateral direction, projecting from the housing. They turned counterclockwise. In essence, the structure and design of the craft, as well as its mechanical movements and controls, were of utmost simplicity. The sets of rotors, set 6 feet apart, revolved in opposite directions around the ship. They were power-driven during ascent, but turned freely in pure aerodynamic descent if the motor failed, thus allowing the craft to float down under direction from its chosen height at a slower speed than that of a parachutist. Wow. Airborne directional control was attained by changing the angle of the upper set of rotors. This is forward or reverse thrust was accomplished. That is, forward or reverse thrust was accomplished by tilting mechanisms to the top bank of the rotors. Thus, slippage took place toward the lower side with advancing blades riding downgrade, retreating blades gaining altitude. According to Coldwell's description, it was the same principle which birds used in flight, substituting rotors for feathered wings and tail. The bottom of the craft could be made watertight, enabling it to take off from land or water. To raise capital for his forthcoming enterprise and float costs, Coldwell attempted unsuccessfully and repeatedly to sell stock in his aviation marvel's names, the Rotorplanes Incorporated, even offering up to $5 for a trial ride in the machine. The stock certificates read in part that the stock for this invention, which which invention is used in the development of an aeroplane designed to fly on the bird principle of flight, and that the stock is worth $10 to $100 per share, depending on his Coldwell's success in developing the aeroplane. Eventually, a curious Army Air Corps colonel, Peter B. Watkins, dressed in civilian attire, that's civvies, appeared as a prospective buyer whom the delighted inventor took for a test flight. The colonel was permitted to take controls and was astonished at the craft's advanced maneuverability over the bi-wing and mono-wing aeroplanes of the 1930s at that time. The colonel flew the machine for 45 miles to Washington, D.C., where he made 100-mile-per-hour passes over Washington Monument and the White House. The colonel was elated when he actually stopped the forward motion of the machine and hovered for a few minutes directly over the 241-foot-high Washington Monument. Upon return to the city, he was granted an interview with the President Franklin D. Roosevelt. He told the president that Coldwell's mystery plane was so advanced in design that to avoid copy by foreign military, the United States should immediately obtain control of patents and production. Roosevelt agreed with the colonel, asking him to reevaluate the project and report back in 30 days for congressional approval. Within 30 days, without apparent congressional approval, Roosevelt and Coldwell received a letter from the Attorney General of Maryland advising him to cease and desist the sale of the stock in his new company. Previous solicitations to sell new stock in New York 1934 and New Jersey 1932 had likewise been stopped by their state attorney generals. Coldwell, in effect, was forced out of his new aviation venture before it even got off the ground. In the autumn of 1936, Coldwell disappeared and officially was never heard of again. Curious. Now, either Coldwell disappeared and walked away from all of this, or B, he was whitewashed in order to not have it come back on the US government anyway, about them stealing his patents or obtaining all of this. The question of Jonathan E. Coldwell and how he could have disappeared so completely from society was a mystery which baffled the author for almost 3 years. Here we go, we're going to get into that now. As I said, this is the first time for me reading this as well. So little information could be unearthed, only scraps of newspaper accounts, which had been quickly developed. And then in November of 1978, a break came in the case of the missing inventor. Jonathan E. Coldwell, who had been 37 years of age when last seen or heard publicly, he would be close to 80 years old today at the time of the writing of that book. Was he the one to whom we had established a vicarious attachment and to whom we had dedicated this book before we were certain he existed or was still alive? The American who was to become the world's greatest genius in the field of aerodynamics and who invented the world's first round-wing plane, which millions of viewers have labeled UFOs, was born in St. Louis, Missouri in 1899. His name one day would become greater than the Wright brothers, and the city of St. Louis, where he was born, would gain an even greater fame in years to come than had been bestowed on the city by Charles Lindbergh, when named his historic aeroplane that took him across the Atlantic, the Spirit of St. Louis. Yes, I remember that plane. But before Jonathan E. Coldwell was to become preoccupied with a vision of how man could overcome his own absence of wings, World War I would break out. To Coldwell, the war would be a chance to fly aeroplanes, and 1917 would see him volunteering for the service of the United States Army, where his training at Kelly Field, Texas, in fixed-wing biplanes would be a forerunner for overseas duty in France. Coldwell came out of service as a lieutenant in 1918. He rejoined the Army Air Corps reservists in summer of 1921 and again found himself stationed at Kelly Field with a small group of World War I flyers who had returned for retraining and to brush up on their flying skills and ability. One day, of that 1921 summer at Kelly Field, a few young officers, including Coldwell, took out some saucers and tin plates and began tossing them through the air at each other to be caught during a few minutes of relaxation and horseplay. It was during this period in young Coldwell's life that he became enthralled with the idea of developing a completely new design of aircraft. At first, he was hardly aware of his own intentions. From sources, Coldwell tried paper planes. Whether the object he drew was a saucer or a paper or tin plate, or even a military wide brim hat, Coldwell made some pertinent observations. Such rounder objects, when thrown and spun into the air or wind, sailed smoothly, travelled faster, and climbed higher than any other shape or form or shape. Coldwell, while in France, had learned the hard way about a fixed wing plane. He knew that if the propeller turned at sufficient revolutions per minute and the prop pitch was properly set, the plane could ride along the airflow induced by the propeller's own current. But if the motor were to fail and the prop ceased to turn, the unbalanced plane would nosedive or spin to earth out of control. We've seen this. Coldwell himself had crashed, and although unwounded, knew of several young acquaintances to whom such a tragedy had resulted in death. But young Coldwell realized that what made fixed wing planes such a fearful conveyance was not primarily the problem of engine failure and the resultant prop stoppage, which prevented an aircraft from planing through the air. Fundamentally, the first requirement of an aeroplane was one of design, and the basic design of the present aeroplane must be changed. He reasoned that the hurling of the plates and saucers with only one leading edge to cut the air was the primary requirement for perfect aerial transportation. Seems viable to me. Another problem to be overcome was one of balance. He had seen airborne dandelion and milkweed seeds floating along majestically, and he observed maple leaves spin to the earth in a gyrating fashion as they landed gently on the ground. Added to earlier observations of nature's use of air currents to propel seeds, Coldwell never forgot an experience on the battlefield of Flanders when lying injured on the ground beside his downed plane. He kept in his mind occupied by studying an artillery wagon turned on its side, one of the wheels of which periodically kept turning in the gusts of the wind, thus keeping in mind nature's methods of aerial movement along with Flanders' wagon wheel. These observations were added to his own study of the kitchen saucers, which he had tossed repeatedly. That summer of 1921, Coldwell decided to build himself a 12-inch round model of a new aerodynamic structure. He would use a delicate balsam wood frame to cover it with a shellackled, is that right? Shellackled, yes. Shellackled tissue paper. And the continuous circular edge would be downlipped, so that when it was released, inverted into the wind, it would ride on its own cushion of air. Thus was born the idea of the first round wing plane, a simplification of that model of a new type of aerodynamic structure eventually became the plaything of children all over the world, a frisbee. I had one of those as a kid. Everyone loves a frisbee. Yes, I loved my frisbee as a kid. Yeah, I can see where it was derived from now. As Coldwell watched the frisbee-like object skip sail through the air, propelled by elastic bands and riding on his own cushion, he was fascinated by the same recurring thoughts. Someday he would try and build a model large enough to hold a man in the exact center point, and if he could install a motor in such an aerial conveyance to give constant density and the cushion beneath the circular plane, and if that cushion of air could be manually directed, he would overcome all the disadvantages inherent in a fixed wing plane. Indeed. Coldwell kept his vision alive. He retained his balsam prototype and all the drawings and design ideas scribbled on traced scribbled or traced on scraps of paper or the backs of envelopes. The idea that he would build a circular plane never left Coldwell's creative brain. Someday he knew he would invent one that could hover or develop forward thrust and down and back faster than vintage planes of the 1920s. As reservists packed and left Kelly Field in 1921 to return to their jobs, the young Coldwell was careful to keep his notes and drawings and to pack along with him his first balsam and tissue paper model. At the time, he lived in Denver, Colorado. Sparked by enthusiasm of fellow pilots at Kelly Field, the young inventor seriously began his first motor-operated model of the new round-wing plane design. With the aid of a welder mechanic friend in the roundhouse of Rio Grande Southern Locomotive Works in Denver, in 1922, they turned out a 12-inch model powered by an erector-set toy motor and single-cell dry battery used in telephone transmission. Wires connected from the battery to the model, as well as 3-foot rope hitch, provided lift for purposes of studying the operational characteristics of the model. Battery contact was made as the round wing model spun and rose in the air. The attentive trio watched as the rope became taut. As the amazed Coldwell observed the performance, he and his helpers saw the battery and the 52-pound table on which it sat rise slowly in the air as the model plane ascended vertically and lodged itself and its suspended contacts against the shop ceiling. Electric current was cut and the heavy cable and plane fell to the floor with a bang. Coldwell swore his helpers to silence and took home his 12-inch model, which today is in the Washington, D.C. U.S. Patent Office. After the Herculean lift by the 12-inch model, an elated Coldwell immediately began work on a 12-foot model, which was truly a forerunner of the round-wing plane of later years. He and his railroad friends completed the project in 1923 and tested their machine in the yards outside Denver Roundhouse. The first about 500 pounds, then a ton of weight, and finally 3,000 pounds of rails were tied together and attached to the model plane. Those rails were lifted with apparent ease. Then the speed of the revolving blade was decreased and the rails lowered to the ground from the highest elevation of 12 feet. Next, the 12-foot model was attached to a mountain locomotive type of the Rio Grande Railroad. As all watched the experiment, they saw the round plane lift into the air as the front end of the big locomotive rose slowly at least 3 inches from the tracks, like a reluctant steed. The yard mechanic called out, "Oh, Lord, what power have we let loose?" But the plane's bottom frame broke and the engine fell onto the tracks again. But Coldwell was unable to raise venture capital in Colorado for the new aerodynamic invention. And several years later, this failure would result in his going east, first to New York, then to New Jersey, and finally Maryland, where a decade later he would attempt his venture again. During the 1920s, the USA found its renewed industrial strength as people like Henry Ford mass-produced the Model T automobiles, the growing use of which would eventually link the country with a system of roads and change the American lifestyle. Jonathan E. Coldwell thought of future highways in the sky. Indeed, we've seen things like this in Coruscant on Star Wars, Skyways, or Back to the Future, floating cars. In the years ahead, he flew the early mails in fast single-engine planes and hauled bananas in cumbersome air freighters for the United Fruit Company. The same decade also saw the 2 and 3 motored planes make their debuts, and pioneer flyer Coldwell could also be found at the controls of such aeroplanes flying geologists into the wild of Venezuela and Central America, seeking locations for a source of new liquid gold called petroleum. Well, we all know where that went in history. When not on a scheduled flight, he loved to rent a plane and barnstorm around the countryside and provide rides in the new aerial wonder that most people had never seen. He also became a test pilot for a large airplane manufacturer, now out of business, and worked on and tested Lindbergh's Spirit of St. Louis with Lindbergh, who later reciprocated by trying out an early prototype of Coldwell's Grey Goose helicopter machine. Also in the 1920s, Coldwell worked with Robert Edward Lee Cohn of St. Petersburg, Florida, head of the Army Air Corps. Cohn was Billy Mitchell's adjutant and became one of Coldwell's most important contacts because several years later, Billy Mitchell would remember about the Maverick flyer Coldwell, who seriously toyed with the new circular design principle for air travel. Mitchell would write a letter to the young Coldwell, urging him to keep his research and to be careful not to let his project fall in the hands of foreign government. After about 12 years of earning and living flying airplanes and a stint as a licensed Colorado stockbroker located in Denver from 1928 to 1930, which at that time he was married, Coldwell decided that he must attempt a full-scale project. In the year of 1933, he had built Leith, his last 12-foot model and believed he had taken all the bugs out of the latest design. That summer, he returned to Kelly Field for the last time as a reservist. With him, he packed a 12-inch miniature model to show friends. Many watched Coldwell's round-wing model plane perform in a series of maneuvers that got people talking. Word soon reached the high Army Air Corps echelons. Plans for what he named a rotoplane were later drawn up and perfected in the early 30s. And in 1935, Coldwell incorporated the Rotoplanes listings his new address as Glen Burnie, Maryland, and showing his wife, Olive. As Secretary Treasurer and brother-in-law, Carl H. Davis, as Vice President, the next year he began his last full-size model intended to be used as a commercial basis. Thus, before 1936, the industrious Coldwell had already built and discarded the Grey Goose plane, the forerunner of today's helicopter. From the Grey Goose idea, he had improved the design in a revolutionary concept, and by mid-1936 had built his final round-wing plane, in which Army Air Corps Colonel Watkins had taken a ride and tested to his own satisfaction. Then in October 27, 1936, Coldwell received a letter from the Secretary of War. It went, pursuant to the recent conversations, we feel your invention is too important to fall into enemy hands. The US government therefore is offering you $50,000 for patent rights on the Grey Goose and rotoplane, and is also prepared to allow for future royalty payments. The Army Air Corps is also prepared to enlist your services as a full-time officer with higher rank than your present captaincy. The next day, Jonathan Coldwell boarded a train for Washington. He sat down in Arlington, Virginia, hotel, and discussed his future with Chief of Staff Army, several aeronautical experts, key congressmen, and members of the cabinet. The delegation reconvened at the White House, where Coldwell met President Roosevelt and came away with the rank of lieutenant colonel and the annual salary of $10,000. It's pretty good for that time. That's damn good, actually, for that time of year, for that point in history. For the good of the service, Jonathan E. Coldwell that day had to make his most difficult decision for him and his wife. He would surrender his family name, Coldwell, and never again be known as such.
For all intents and purposes, he would disappear from society till the day he would die. In 1949, long after Coldwell's disappearance, some children ventured through a broken window into a so-called haunted tobacco barn in Maryland, the location of which is now the city limits of Baltimore, and later told their parents they had seen a flying saucer. Old FBI files and newspaper stories dated August 21, 1949, filed by United States Press and Associated Press, appearing in the Baltimore Sun, Washington Post, etc., told briefly what had been found. The deputy sheriff of Anne Arundel County, father of one of the boys, was asked to accompany the boys back to the scene. He confirmed their story, unknowingly having found Coldwell's original Grey Goose and first rotoplane. On notifying the Air Force, the barn was placed off limits, and a new generation of Air Force investigators, unaware of Coldwell or his inventions, carted the strange craft off to Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Dayton, Ohio. Wright-Pat's somewhere that we know very well of throughout history that has quite a lot of surrounding strange craft. Air Force officers at the Pentagon were red-faced when they finally found the files that explained the mystery. For since the day Coldwell vacated his original workshop environment, his inventions had lain forgotten and neglected in the old tobacco barn. On November 8th of 1978, at Kensington, Maryland, an historic book on Coldwell was brought up from vaults for the researcher to read for 2 hours. On the leather-bound cover, hand-printed in gold leaf, was the name Jonathan E. Coldwell, and on the fly leaf inside, 16-inch by 11-inch by 6-inch book, it was written that some of the most valuable records of mankind were preserved herein. The contents were perhaps as important to the US as the Bill of Rights or the early life of President Abraham Lincoln. And to the rest of the world, the knowledge discovered by Coldwell was told by the memos and letters in the leather-bound scrapbook would also become a treasure, which they someday would share. A permission was given to pursue the book before it was returned. Peruse, I should say, not pursue. Peruse the book before, that's to look over, if you don't know what peruse is. To peruse the book before it was returned to its deep underground vault. The rules were explained. Guards would be present. The entire contents would be read and studied. No notes or diagrams were to be made, nor pictures taken. Just to see and read the book briefly had required the signatures of the President of the United States, the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the Commanding General of the US Air Force, the Director of the National Archives, and the Director of the Library of Congress. As the researcher looked at the cover and opened the book, he was filled with awe. What he saw was a pre-glance at history, the full contents of which could not be made available to the public till after the year 2000. Okay, well that's pretty interesting, because here we are now in the year 2023, and roughly since, if any of you have been following the disclosure movement since roughly 2001, especially the Washington Press Club. I watched the Washington Press Club later, many years later, when I discovered it. I did not know about it in 2001. At that time, I wasn't even net savvy or able to use a computer at that point in time, not until many years later. But yeah, we can see that through the testimonies of those that have come forward as whistleblowers and those that have been involved in some of these compartmentalized programs that were involved in the Washington Press Club disclosure in 2001, clearly this was, to a degree by design in relation to this book, that none of which that was inside that book or any of the other specific details that had been kept from the public could not be disclosed until after the year 2000, which I think then goes back, into this next, chapter 3 in the international response to UFO phenomena. Okay, now this gets into things that, along the lines of the 1936, as you can see there, 1936 incidents. Also 1947, Roswell, New Mexico, Aztec, New Mexico, as well. But so many others. I mean, there's just thousands of events that have happened. But in saying that, who are they? Okay, well, we get into that as we go through this. And as I said before, I'll be discovering this myself, with these guys, as we read through each chapter. It's going to be fascinating because I've not got any of this information. I was have mentioned briefly before is that I saw a brief mentioning of this book with Journey to Truth podcast on their show one day between Tyler and Aaron, talking about their DUMS, deep underground military bases, and the inner Earth networks or Agartha networks. Okay, and they touched base on this book briefly, and I reached out to Tyler and got his permission because I didn't want to step on anyone's toes in relation to this book, because I thought possibly that these guys might be having a plan in the future to maybe cover more of this book. So out of respect for the guys, as I've mentioned in the previous video, that I reached out to him and I received Tyler's permission to go ahead and actually read this book for everyone chapter by chapter, because he said it's very important that we go through this book, because it sets the precedent in a sense of how the government went around the compartmentalization of the UFO or UAP phenomenon, and how for the last, especially better part of 70 years now, no oversight whatsoever, and the military industrial complex and how they've gotten away with so much and corporatized everything privately, so that you just understand where I'm going with this anyway. But all I can say is that this has been fascinating truly to be able to read this with you guys and share it with you, because this goes later on into the inner Earth networks and how they are connected to our ancients, okay, and those that are back now with the Galactic Fed, and how they too themselves were here over 400,000 years ago. Okay, how this is all connected together. This is going to be fascinating discovery for all of us. So yeah, please join us for chapter 3, because I'll be going with that one next. This has been a pleasure, I must say. So in saying that, I'm going to say goodbye for the time being. It's actually, for me, it's Tuesday night as I'm recording this. So I've got to go and have myself some dinner and get my kitty cat some dinner, old Bodie. And this is signing out for the time being until next time, everyone. But just remember, everyone, from Starseeds and Patriots of Down Under, we can't do this without you, okay? You, the audience, are the backbone of all of this. And as you all know as well, YouTube and all platforms are still heavily shadow banning all of us. So without your help, we can't grow or expand. So please be sure to hit the like button and leave a comment below. If you're not subscribed, please subscribe already as well. Okay, but be sure to share, because by sharing, it gets us out past the algorithms of YouTube and Facebook, share with your friends, etc. Because really, that's what it's all about. Bringing a community together to create something that's beautiful that we can all join in on. And the only way we're going to do that is by sharing this sort of information and getting it out past the YouTube algorithms. Okay, so I can't ask you enough. Please share amongst your friends, and if you can, bring a new person with you to, subscribe also as you come back for the next episode, because as I said, we're all trying about growing here, and I'm trying to hit that 1,000 subscriber mark so that I can possibly take Starseeds on the road and do a few places and go a few places and discover some beautiful things and film some beautiful countryside while we're at it. Because that's what we're all about here, is discovery and telling truth. So for the time being, everyone, please share, like, subscribe, and leave a comment below. And I'll be leaving the link in the description for John B. Leith's book, Genesis for a New Space Age. For the time being, everyone, with love.
You could try to play, but you're never gonna beat me. Look the other way, what I'm doing ain't easy. Bloody hands stained from the people who deceive me. Muddy hands break through the chains, go free me.
Looking for change, looking for pain, pulling a mob, pushing a train. I'll never stop, stick to a lane, pick up the pieces and go rearrange. I'll be the best above all the rest, put me to the test and expect nothing less. Your check is I'm chess, what's happening next? Yeah. He got the venom, a tangible weapon, no coming in second. This life is a lesson. He got a new engine from pain, it's a blessing. New focus, no guessing, just bold and obsession. All in his possession, you got their attention. I'll leave an impression and take a redemption. Just kill no discretion. Your mind is a weapon. 11-11, it's time for progression. Oh.